Hello and welcome to the show that unpacks the issues shaping our world. This is Timeline, and I am your host, Shana J. And of course, I have with me, as always, my co-hosts.
Omokafe, Hannah Omokafe Dennis, of course, being here with Sharon. And as always, we are not alone when it comes to Timeline. We have we always have somebody in the studio today. And today we have Godwin Lasisi. Hello, Godwin.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Well, our guest is a public health professional. Nice to have you in the studio with us, Godwin.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a privilege to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Well, on today's episode, we are diving into a topic that affects every single one of us, yet often doesn't get the attention it deserves. And I know you might be wondering, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're talking about clean water, the link between quality water and human well-being. For many of us, turning on a tap is second nature. But for nearly 1 in 3 people worldwide, access to safe, clean water remains a daily struggle. And the consequences go far beyond taste, from waterborne diseases to child mortality, and from gender inequality to environmental stress. The quality of water we drink is directly linked to how healthy, safe, and dignified our lives can be. You know, when we talk about safe drinking water, we talk about hygiene, sanitation. It's crucial to human health and, of course, human well-being. And we all know that it's not just only a prerequisite for health, but also it contributes largely to livelihood and also dignity, right, Omokafe?
Of course, and this is the reason why the UN decided, not the UN per se, but the entire advocacy body said that SDG 6, which is access to quality water, is very paramount, is very important for every single person, whether they are children, they are young women, they are girls, they are youth, young people across the entire world. It's very important because it leads to so many things, including economic benefits. So if nobody is strong enough to go to work, how on earth is our economy going to thrive? That's what we're having in today's world.
Yeah, quite interesting. Let's throw a question to you, Godwin. Let's start from the basis. Why is access to clean water a powerful intervention of public health?
Thank you. I mean, you put me on the spot now because so first off, I'll start off with even before we begin to talk about access, I like the fact that you spoke about clean.
Yeah.
So there was a caveat to it. It's not just any kind of water, right? So clean water being essential. You had spoke about earlier saying water is not just a prerequisite for good health. It's basically linked to everything that we see, everything as we know it as human beings. So in talking about access to clean water, for me, one of the first key things we want to look about is who are the persons that are involved? Who are the persons that are affected by it? You see that the world, 70% of the world is covered by water. So, why are we now saying there's water lacking, right? So then we now begin to understand that it's not just water we're talking about. It's the quality, it's also the quantity. You'd also look at things like how evenly distributed is this water? And then we begin to talk about equity, right? So, for instance, this show is being shot in an urban area, right? You look at rural communities, you look at grassroots communities. Yes, they have water. If we probably drill a hole into the floors or the grounds of those communities, yes, we'll be able to get water, but is it even accessible to them? Is the water clean? Yes, it's clean. Is it there? Yes, it's there. But can they access it? No. So that's one thing. So that's when we begin to talk about, okay, so what infrastructures needs to be in place for them to be able to access this water and for it to be clean as well. And probably we just jump in the gun, but then we want to begin to talk about the technologies in place to ensure that they get access to this clean water. Because, a well could be dug, yes. Could a borehole be dug, yes. So, but when we look at in terms of the cleanliness of those two different sources of water, are they the same? Not so much, right? So for me, it's in talking about access to clean water, I want to look at the population. We also want to look at the access. We also want to look at how purified is it, like what's the level of purity. And then also, I think holistically is the socioeconomic caveats that are attached to water resources. And that's when we begin to talk about equity. Because again, talking about rural communities and grassroots environments, yes, a borehole could be dug. Yes, there's now access to clean water, but then it could also be monetized, right? Say there's a chief of the community who says, to ensure maintenance of this borehole, pay 15 naira per gallon of water you get. So yes, the water is there. Yes, it's clean. But then we're talking about in terms of accessibility, there are certain socioeconomic factors that influence all of this. So for me, talking about clean water and it's being essential to how we, as human beings, access it, I would say there's a lot of things that exist, and I'll call it just four. Accessibility, quality, the socioeconomic factors, and then also its purity.
Quite interesting. When we talk about health, often people associate it with, hospitals, doctors, medical line and all of that. I want you to shed a light on how underestimated quality water is to the overall well-being of a population.
Interesting. So when you talk about overall well-being, I mean, it's funny because I think it closely even relates to the work that I do. And so I'm a young public health professional, right? I mean, I'm not old, so of course I'm young,
course.
right?
We are young too, so.
I mean, I will do no.
Wow.
No shades.
Interesting.
So yeah, I mean, I work within the public health space, and given the work that I do, yes, I work a 9 to 5 with a management consulting firm, Sidani Group, where we implement projects that ensure sustainability in grassroots communities. I also own a foundation, right, CAS Educational Foundation. And so with that organization, what we do is how do we bridge the gap between policy and practice in terms of how young people, how communities access basic amenities. So it could be through exposing them to global agendas like the SDGs. It would be something as simple as even just an awareness. And which is when you ask the question about how access to water affects the overall well-being of persons in the community and the population. So very recently, there was a project we implemented. When I say we, I mean my organization, CAS Educational Foundation, in partnership with the UN, UNODC. And so it was basically focused on wildlife conservation. Now, someone will think, oh, what does wildlife have to do with water, right? So there's a very close link between zoonotic diseases, animals, and water bodies, right? So we look at something as simple as clogged water bodies and the breeding of mosquitoes. Stagnant water is the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. Yes, it's water, but how is it that source of water or that body of water is now the reason why someone falls sick? Why is it that it's the reason why it's a breeding ground for mosquitoes and ultimately links to illnesses and disease? So for me, it's seeing how I would say there are pockets of chains that leads up to access and quality of water. So it's more of, I'd say, I'm trying to get the perfect, but I'd say it's a multidimensional issue, because in looking at quality of water and looking at access to water and how important it is to the entire population, you see it's linked to so many other things. It's linked to wildlife conservation. It's linked to good health and well-being. And when we look at the SDGs, you look at, say, SDG 1, you look at SDG 2, even right up until 17, Partnership for the Goals, it basically affects every other thing. And I really like the fact, beginning this conversation, when she spoke about women and young people, you look at gender equality, you look at period poverty, you look at girls in schools, limited access to quality water or clean water can't even help them stay clean. You look at how it affects their hygiene as well. So for me, it's quite, it's all-encompassing, really, because in as much as it affects us as young people in terms of how do we even get clean water to stay fit or even to stay hydrated. I know the girls will say a girl has to stay hydrated. I mean, little miss has to stay hydrated. Yeah, and all of that. But it also affects even down to their health and well-being. So in staying clean, in ensuring that there's hygiene, there needs to be access to water, right? Say a girl, like periods meets her in school. How can she keep herself clean if there's no quality access to water and all of that? And so even in eating too, I mean, you're done eating, is there even quality water for you to drink, right? So all of these issues for me, I think is all encompassing really in how it affects us as an entire population.
I like the fact that you made mention of period poverty. I remember one time in one of our shows where we talked about how Nigeria has finally signed or brought about the menstrual health policy, where it leads to, of course, there's no more period poverty because girls are now being educated and tax is taken away from menstrual pads, so now you can access it as cheap as a tissue paper, and of course you're healthy. Now that is one thing that policy has been able to solve. And away from policies, first of all, let's look at consequences. I know there are several things that lack of quality water can bring. From my personal experience, typhoid. Let's say you do not have enough clean water, or the tap water that you even get to access is not clean enough, and before you know it, you have typhoid, or probably you have cholera and everything like that. So for some other consequences that people might not probably know, probably away from cholera and typhoid, what are those other consequences that poor water or poor consumption of water can lead to?
Interesting. So to be honest, I don't think it's an exhaustible list, right? It's inexhaustible in terms of the number of of, I would say, chain reactions that limited access to water would cause. So first is, I always like to think about it in terms of sectors. So what sectors do water as a concept affect? So yes, you've spoken about health in terms of diseases that it could cause, typhoid, cholera, and all of that. But I also think it affects the socioeconomic part of things, right? Earlier I'd spoken about how in trying to solve a problem, which is looking at limited access to water, right? There's no water in the community. Say you work with an organization, a funding agency that maybe digs a borehole, right? Now the water exists, but then in terms of access, there needs to be provision of funds by the population of that community to access that water. So is it 10 naira, is it 20 naira, is it 15 naira? I mean, even right here in my community, here in Abuja, there was a time where our pumping machine got bad, right? And so we had to buy water in gallons, right? So you look at situations like that. I mean, for me, I don't know, but you calculate 15 naira, 100 naira, 200 naira, by the time you pull off that in a month, not all families, look at one standard minimum wage, right? By the time you pull all these monies together, how much does the family even earn in a month? Where they now need to begin to cut out cost for accessing water. So that's one. Second is looking at how it affects their standard of living. Now, I would say for me, it's like moving from frying pan to fire, right? As a family or as a person, you are striving to eat, you're striving to buy data, you're striving to do a lot of things with money. And so, and again, I think it's a very common thing for us in Nigeria where we don't even see water as a necessarily big problem. We don't see water as, water is a God-given resource. It's not so much and I think it's one of the reasons why I think to an extent we are still facing a lot of issues battling clean access to water, access to clean water rather, and quality water resources, because the level of importance we place on it, it's not so great. So for me, yes, it affects the economics, the social part of things, but it also affects standard of living, because in cutting down the costs of accessing water, it allows you to direct that sources of funding to other, getting other basic amenities, really. So for me, I think it's those two major areas.
Okay. Thank you very much, Godwin. As much as we are talking about this, there are a lot of persons online that are also in their view about, lack of access to clean water and all of this. But of course, we are going to go on a short break. And when we return, Omo Cafe will take us through social commentaries. Stay with us.
Everybody has a stake in making the world a better place with love and compassion. As we thrive daily, we continue to strive to face the many challenges that faces our Earth, because together, we all matter. On one side, we are exploring the captivating stories, the trends, the glamour, while on the other hand, we're looking at the love, the care and compassion from our champions. In our Stars Quiet Cove lies the burning passion for humanity, which is seldom known and unsung to the world. Join me on Famed to look at the flip side of your favorite beyond the regular.
Welcome back. If you are just tuning in, this is Timeline. And of course, we have our guest in the house, Godwin Lasisi. Omo Cafe, kindly take us
definitely. There are always a lot of people on social media who have opinions on every single thing that's going on in our world. And water, of course, which everybody gets to take. There's no how you tell me you have not drunk water today. Have you drunk water today?
Of course.
You drank water today.
Not really.
So you have not drunk water. Okay, after the show, please kindly bring water for him. So that is, I say everybody gets water, everybody accesses water. It might not necessarily be clean, but at least everybody gets to access it. In Abuja here, the sun is getting really hot, so of course you have to drink water. And this is from Sulina. Now she says that I am thinking about women in their periods, nursing mothers, young girls who have now been displaced. Access to clean water and safety is a dream at this moment. This is really terrifying. Help if you can, please. Nothing is too small. Please send whatever you can. And this just goes to emphasize on the points that we had said earlier when we were talking about period poverty and how women are not able to access water, especially when they're in their periods. And this one right here is emphasizing that.
Absolutely.
This one is from Claire as Crystal. I think it's a funny one. She said, who said water that comes out from the kitchen tap is cleaner than the one from the toilet? Please, public health enthusiasts and experts, kindly answer her question.
So for me, I think I'd answer this in two ways, most likely. And that's because I think there's a myth to it, which is, in every Nigerian home, who is asking you to drink water from the toilet, and who is saying the one in the kitchen is not so clean? So for me, I think there's that myth to it of cultural bias to say, water in toilets are not so clean, and then the one in the kitchen is clean. Because at the end of the day, it runs through the same pipe. But I think coming down to the science of it is in terms, again, of its access. So typically in the kitchen, there's a more conscious effort to keep the environment clean, right? It's not like, of course, the toilets are supposed to be kept clean and really hygienic, but when it comes to kitchen where food is being cooked and all of that, there's constantly an effort to ensure that it's clean. And the surroundings where the water comes from the tap is really clean. But in the toilets now, God knows what happens there, right? So in getting the water from the tap, your assumption is, what has happened to this? What has touched this tap? So that conscious effort to ensure that it's always clean, it's not so clear, except maybe in hotels where frequently you see staffs coming in to ensure that it's clean, right? But down to the science of it is, I think it comes down to the hygiene, right? And I think even as young people, I always like to speak to young people because we are the future adults, right? There needs to be a constant and deliberate effort to ensure that we do not see issues around water, or even just any really topic in general about, it's their issue, it's their problem, because at the end of the day, it boils down to us. As an individual, we are in a restroom that's even outside of your home. There's a way you treat it, right? But the one in your house, there's also a way you treat it. And if we are being honest, most of the time, there's a very, very clear difference in the way we use restrooms outside and the ones we use at home. So for me, I think there needs to be a very high level of intentionality in terms of how we ensure hygiene in our toilet spaces. So of course, present at my home, I'll drink the water in the toilet. No one should catch me, but again, I think it all comes down to the hygiene of it.
Okay, let's take a look at the last one before we, of course, move back. And this is from Wole Soyinka Center. It says that this investigation shows that the 60 million Nigerians lacking access to drinking water has cited by Nigerian Demographic and Health Survey, and not just numbers, they represent a critical issue with real-world impact. So there was a research and an investigation by the Wole Soyinka Center that showed that a lot of Nigerians, especially numbers, 60 million Nigerians, lack access to drinking water. So it means that, you had mentioned earlier that 70% of the entire earth is covered by water. So imagine that 60 million Nigerians cannot access water, even though 70% of the entire earth is covered by water.
I'd say it's very ironic, right? Because again, there's water is so cross-cutting, right? It ties to a number of issues, and which is what earlier I had said. When you look at the socioeconomic part of things, you see that water in some sort of way is tied to the social determinants of health. And that's why studies like the NDHS, the Nigeria Demographic and Health Survey, reveals statistics of a staggering number of 60 million Nigerians. And clearly, you rightfully said it's not just numbers. These are individuals, these are human beings who, in every right of it, they deserve access to clean water, right? But why is it that they do not have access to this clean water? And then we want to begin to look at stuff down to the policy of it in terms of regulations. Because you look at the policies, what does our water policy say in terms of the access, in terms of provision? You look at our budgets, and you see, I would say millions of naira goes into in terms of how much is budgeted to ensure that clean water gets to communities, to grassroots environments. But in terms of implementation, does it actually happen? Right? So for me, I think there's the policy part to it, and there's also the regulation part to it, to ensure that these numbers do not just stay as numbers. And it doesn't increase next year, because population is constantly increasing, right? So 60 million now, what says it's not going to be 100 million next year? So for me, I think there's the regulation part to it, there's also the policy bit to it.
Well, our guest right here has entered into the solutions aspect.
But before we even dive into the solutions, Godwin Lasisi, it's not just about the availability of water. Sometimes it can be economical, it can be political, because we see some countries that are, surrounded by water, resources, rivers, dams, and all of that. Good access, quite a broad, what would I say, vast, water resources, water bodies that it could literally get through to all the citizens and all of that. And you just begin to wonder, why is there inequalities when it gets to water? And now I'm throwing that question to you, of course.
Really?
Why is it that in some water, now, not just countries that have water. We're talking about rich water countries that have, good water bodies. Why is it that there are still inequalities, in those kind of areas?
So I'll start off with 2 points. First is what kind of water is it, right? First is, so there's salt water, there's freshwater bodies. So even in accessing the water, what technologies are in place to ensure that it's purified? You look at water system bodies across like different continents and different countries. Say in Nigeria, we have our water board, right, that runs water through pipes and all of that. I mean, Nigeria is lucky. The kind of water bodies we have, yes, there's Kainji Dam and a lot of other water bodies richly blessed with water in Nigeria. But in terms of purification, we do not strive so much in that aspect. For we in Nigeria, what we usually lack in terms of infrastructures to ensure that this water actually gets down to the communities and, the grassroots environments that actually do need it. But in terms of ensuring that this water is purified, the water is too salty, or this water is not great, so great for drinking, we do not have so much of those problems. But for other countries who experience issues like this, yes, the machinery part to the infrastructure bit to ensure that in as much as these water bodies are vast, is it safe for their drinking? Is it safe for their use, right? So I think there's also that machinery and infrastructure part to ensure that this water is purified enough for it to get to the citizen. And second part is also the political will. Like I mentioned earlier, for me, I think there's this mental bias to see, of course, water is free, right? I have a friend that will argue with me that it's not, but I strongly believe that it's free, right? It's not something that should be monetized in some sort of way. However, there needs to be a considerable amount of resources that goes into ensuring that it stays free. So I'd give a very practical example. Say there's a community A, right? They do not have water. There's no tap, there's no borehole, there's no wells. And a funding agency comes into the organization, meets with the chief heads, the traditional leaders, what have you, digs a borehole, and now there's a pumping machine, there's access to water. Now, someday someone goes to fetch water and damages the pump. What happens? Of course, the resources were made to make the water available, but in terms of maintenance, not so great, right? So in as much as, yes, water is free, it was dug for free, some funding agency took it upon themselves to provide this community with the access to the water they already had. However, were steps and measures taken in place to ensure that the continuous access to this water is kept that same way. So for me, I think it's in that light.
Amazing. We've been talking about water, clean water, and all of that. I think it's time to put a number in the heads of some of our viewers. 2.2 billion people lacked safely managed drinking water, and 3.4 billion lacked safely managed sanitation, and 1.7 billion lacked basic hygiene services at home. Now, this is their most recent report. And, it's really sad to think that, just like you said, water is so free. It is free. You literally see it everywhere. And you're having people, this kind of numbers popping up in regards to water, in regards to hygiene, in regards to sanitation. It's a sad thing, I would say. It's really questionable. But, of course, that's the world we had. That's why we are having this kind of conversation. Just for awareness, and not just for the people, but of course for the, we talked about countries that are water rich, and there's still inadequacy in water, inequalities in water. So we are doing all of this so that not just the viewers, not just the masses, but those up there that can also help to make water accessible to literally those are the grassroots, those literally everybody, around the globe. Let's talk about water and conflict. When people talk about water, I think it's just about drinking, just about and all of that, but there's more to that. Now, history has shown that water is not just for cooperation, but also for conflict. We've had lots of nations, countries fighting because of water, and water accessibility, and this part is mine, that part is yours, and all of that. Now, how real is the risk of future wars being fought on water? Now, this is not something we do talk about, but it's something we have to talk about,
of course,
because it has happened before. How real is the risk of wars being fought on water, future wars?
So for me, I think it's a very, very sensitive issue, and very, very sensitive and delicate issue, because it's political. In as much as politics is very real, I think it's also very, very niche and delicate. And now you'd see, again, like you've mentioned, there are countries that are rich in terms of water, and they are covered by vast bodies of water. But then again, it definitely means that on the contrary, there are also countries who do not have that vast amount of bodies of water. Say countries who are mostly surrounded by desert bodies, right? Countries who do not have as much as access to water as those other countries. And so for me, I think two things are involved. First is international cooperation, and which is why currently, you'd see that, every year, look at the United Nations General Assembly that happens in New York, how world leaders come together to co-create solutions that determines the future. You'd see that international cooperation is almost as critical as the very lives that live within each of these countries that come together to talk about these issues. And which is why, for me, I think in talking about conflict and access to water, one of the key things we want to talk about is cooperation on various scales. So cooperation down at the grassroots levels, because we're even talking about countries, but even within communities, this conflict happens. In order to ensure that these conflicts do not even happen, right? That these future wars don't happen, is how do we ensure collaboration and cooperation? These communities, these countries must ensure that there must be collaboration at the diplomatic level, right? So leaders of these countries, their ministers must ensure that constant communication has to go on. I've really looked at the times of the year where, because again, you look at flooding. Recently, there was a conversation around when the country now that was about to open their dam. It's keeping my mind now, but they were about to open their dam, and opening that dam definitely will affect Lake Chad, right? These communities will be overflooded because the water is going to be released. And so you look at, looking at all of these issues, why does one country opening their dam have to affect us in Nigeria, right? So you see, and for them, it's also for their own good. It's not like they really want to flood communities in our country. Their dam is also getting overflown and they want to release the pressure, right? So you want to look at, okay, how do we want to begin to talk about early warning systems to avoid this conflict? So you look at stuff like, are there even technologies in place to ensure that there's NIMET in Nigeria, there's NEMA, agencies that are responsible for forewarning, for anticipating threats and all of that. So how do we ensure that in terms of water, there are structures in place, there are systems in place to more or less predict when situations will lead up to conflict. And so in doing all of that, then you can now begin to see a very, very significant reduction in terms of how conflicts will erupt.
Yeah, amazing. You talked about the United Nations. Now let's dive into United Nations, the SDG. Now SDG 6 promises clean water and sanitation by 2030. We're in 2025.
Absolutely.
So tell us, what's the timeline? What timeline do you think we are in achieving that target by 2030?
So timelines. So HLPF had happened in New York, the High Level Political Forum. Nigeria had also submitted its VNR. I was part of the process where, in looking up to the High Level Political Forum in New York, where countries were assessed against their progress in advancing the SDGs. Nigeria looked at 6 specific SDGs and looked at our progress in achieving these SDGs. And so there was a validation process in Nigeria where different groups, youth groups, CSOs, NGOs, vulnerable communities had sent representatives to validate that report. And so I was privileged to be part of that report where we looked at the voluntary national review. That's what the VNR means, the SDG voluntary.
I was about to ask what that means.
Yeah, so the VNR is the voluntary national review. And so that happens, there's no specific timeline to it, but all countries are encouraged to have that voluntary national review to look at their progress against the SDGs. And so I was a part of the process where we had looked at Nigeria's progress and validated the report. And so in looking at SDG 6, right, it was clearly pointed out, it was clearly found that we are falling far short of our targets. I'm looking at access to quality water, looking at the technology in place to ensure that this access is concrete and valid, right? We are falling short. However, one of the key things that came out from HLPF in New York was, how do we ensure that even looking up until 2030, we begin to accelerate growth? Because it means the next 5 years are crucial in advancing the SDG, specifically SDG 6. These next 5 years are crucial. We only have 5 years to go. And so how do we ensure that Nigeria as a country does not look at access to water as a problem for us anymore? Let's face other things, right? So it means the next 5 years are crucial. And so what do you want to look at? For me, it's innovation. Innovation from where? I'd say it's from young people. Over 60% of Nigeria's population are youths, right? So it means to drive innovation in order to, let's step away from innovation, in actually being able to combat limited access to water. It means you need to speak to young people. You need to be able to engage young people. We are the ones that are going to be able to drive these innovations, these solutions, right? Because we are in the communities. Most of the time, we are the ones who are most vulnerable. And so for me, I think it primarily sits on innovation. You're able to advance SDG 6 to reach to get to 2030. It's that how do we even begin to first engage young people to co-create solutions that affect them as people, looking at SDG 6. Another thing for me is integration. So integration in what sense? Very recently, we had worked on a project here in Abuja, in Lugbe, Tudunwada community. And so the whole idea behind that project was I had partnered with United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime here in Nigeria. We are looking at how environmental health, human health, and animal health interrelated amongst each other, that nexus, that interconnectedness. And so how do we even begin to look at things like sanitation or recycling? Because remember, even when there's access to clean water, it means if I drop plastic in that water, it means it's contaminated.
Yeah.
Or if a certain community keeps on dumping plastics into their water bodies, it affects their access to the water is even existing. And so we had implemented that project in Tudunwada called the Youth for One Health Project. And what was the idea was how do we even expose the minds of young people to development, ensuring that their minds are fine-tuned towards innovation to advance the SDGs, specifically SDGs like SDG 6, access to clean sanitation, because in taking climate action like recycling, like collecting plastics, it means you are avoiding the problem of clogged water bodies, right? You're also looking at good health and well-being, SDG 3, because because there's access to clean water, persons can stay healthy. Look at SDG 5, gender equality. Look at the kind of challenges that women as a population face in terms of menstrual poverty. It means if they have access to clean water, so next time we can advance our goals. And so for me, I think it's one of the reasons why they say all 17 goals are interconnected. Because in advancing SDG 6, you also see advancement in other specific SDGs. And I'll round it off with SDG 17, which is partnership for the goals. I always emphasize that partnership, collaboration is the new innovation, right? For us to be able to advance access to clean water, for us to be able to ensure that communities have constant access to quality clean water, I think partnership and collaboration sits at the basis of it. Young people, governments, NGOs, CSOs, I'd say organizations even like us, where we sit down here and talk, there needs to be an intentional effort to co-create solutions, to collaborate, to pitch ideas, bring to life solutions that solve our own challenges, because nobody is coming to save us. They're the ones that have to save ourselves.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Godwin. We've spoken extensively in regards to clean water, the health, and all of that. Thank you once again. Well, it's been a remarkable conversation, I must say, an enlightening conversation, an educative one at that. We almost even listed all the SDGs.
Right, really.
Partnership and collaboration. What else?
Well, thank you once again. That's where we draw the line on Timeline today. I am your host, Sharona J.
And of course, I am Hannah. I'm a cafe in school, with Sharon. Bye.